2023, nearly our best year ever. I think half of you will disagree with that immediately, because for half of you, it was not a terribly good year. However, some of the good bits, and there's some really good sites, had an amazing year. I live here in the Vale of York on a farm. I get to walk it every morning, and I've never seen the numbers that I saw last year. Just the regular species, the ringlets, the meadow browns, the small skippers. I've never seen so many small skippers for years. Um, let's just take a little trip back in time before we dive into that, and just look back at climate change and the things that are happening out there. I've taken this back all the way back to 1884. The simple reason was, and it's a cataclysmic event by Krakatoa in 1883. We had 4 or 5 really dark years after that. It, like the loss of the dinosaurs after the great asteroid, it was a very grim time, and we lost a huge number of species from Yorkshire. But then it bounced back. And then through the following decades, it went up and down. And you see at the bottom there, I've marked warm spells, cool spells. And this is, you can go back hundreds of years, thousands of years. There's nothing new about rapid change in temperature and the kind of things we've seen in recent times. We have to be honest, there's been 40 ice ages. At the present time, we're in the interglacial period, 15,000 years, 10,000 years into it. This is the warm spell of a 50,000 year cycle. So most of the time, this island of ours is a lump of ice with no butterflies. And I think you've got to remember that. They come, they go, and the stories that I'm going to tell are basically that. So on this chart, the red line is the kind of like the COVID graphs we used to see on the TV. This is the moving average, just to get a better feel of what's been happening to temperature. When do we see these rises and then falls? And the 1930s, 1940s, there was a warm spell. We lost a lot of species back in the turn of the centuries. They tended to come back to some extent in the 30s and 40s. Particularly these warm years were often associated with species returning to Yorkshire. Now, remembering that Yorkshire is very special because it's the northern line between northern species and southern species, and that line has moved from just below the south of the county all the way through the county over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And we're going to see quite a lot of that tonight. So let's pick out a few years when species returned. And over here, you see a chart here with when species actually returned. 1911, small copper. And when I say return, I mean when there's been a significant rise in abundance somewhere near the Vale of York. So I'm using Vale of York because York is a big place. Yorkshire is a big place. So I'm using the Vale of York as the place. You notice that Peacock Small Heath returned in that big peak, 32, 34. Large Skipper, 47. Common Blue, then back in 1970. Then things got really interesting because we hit a minimum here. And there is a line just above 18 degrees where everything seems to take off. But 18.4 degrees centigrade, species began to return in quick succession. So you'll see the names here. I'm not going to read them all out. It would take me too long. But you can see there the number of species that we can see in and around York has almost doubled over that period from 1963 till today. So if you've been in York in the 70s, you wouldn't have seen orange tip, you wouldn't have seen marble white, you wouldn't have seen brimstone, you wouldn't have seen hair streak. The list is long. So we've come a long way. And roughly, species are arriving in Yorkshire 1 every 4 years, which is a difficult figure to get your head around. The latest one, and we could argue about it, 2022, Purple Emperor arrived in Sheffield. Just one, but it was there. That's the important bit. It's not established. I don't think it's breeding. None were seen last year. What will be the next one? Well, there's a mighty queue forming just across the channel. There must be at least a dozen species waiting. And this last year, we do have a new UK species breeding. The American painted lady arrived in the Isles of Scilly and is bred now for 2 years on the Isles of Scilly. So just to show you, this is very, very dynamic. So how was 2023? Back down to earth. Autumns are important because that's when a lot of things go into hibernation. And caterpillars, and a lot of our species hibernate as caterpillars, are very susceptible to fungi in particular. If they don't go cleanly into diapause, hibernate, then they can get stressed and they can die. So even though it's warm and there's a heavy rainfall in the autumn, the switch to winter was very quick. In the beginning of December, it froze, and it was a very quick transition. I think that's important. The same happened last year, and I think that may be responsible for some of the good results that we see this year. So Yorkshire's winter, well, it was significantly warmer, 2 degrees, that's ridiculously warm. February was exceptional. Spring was somewhat average, although it was somewhat dominated by those cold easterly winds I mentioned. April was difficult because of that coldness. I know a lot of us failed to do any transects. I think I managed 2 or 3 on my transects. But May, it changed. It was warmer than average and it was dry. But then things got really interesting. So June was exceptional. And I think this is the crucial month of the year. So many, at the beginning of June, so many of our caterpillars are in their final instar. If that goes quickly, because they're at their most vulnerable, because they're big, they're juicy, and the birds are feeding their young. So it's a quick and easy big meal for a blue tit, for example, to find a nice big fat caterpillar. If you can get through that quickly, your chances of survival are so much better. Remember all those hundreds of eggs that got laid, because it was beautiful weather last year. If those eggs survived, then we only need a few % shift in survival to really cause a big change in numbers this year. So as I say, I think June clinched the year numbers-wise, because once July has arrived, you can see it here. It was cold, it was wet, it was thoroughly awful. I think some of us missed a number of transects, down ½ degree. August was somewhat average. It had good and bad bits mixed in. September was exceptionally warm. And of course, we know what's happened this year. We've had it exceptionally warm into autumn. It's been a bit seesaw. We had a cold beginning to December, but then it's been largely very warm, very, very wet. But that often happens after a really dry period that we had in 2022. So that's the weather. The results, this is the bit that we're interested in. What this shows is the species along the bottom and the percentage change, the winners and the losers. So losers on the right, the red, the blue is the winners. And you can see equal number, the important bits are equal numbers of winners and losers. Overall, the numbers were up 9%. And it's very close to our all-time record, which was 2014, which was also a year after a hot, sunny 2013, which is the last really good year. It just managed to beat 2018. The winners are largely the climate change winners. Brimstone, we covered that last year in great detail. Holly Blue, the Red Admiral. Well, Red Admiral had an exceptional year. It was their best year on record. Same for Brimstone, same for Holly Blue, same for Marble White, the best year on record. Speckled Wood, also the best year on record. Quite exceptional. And they're all winners in the climate change. The losers, there's a few of them, are those that seem to suffer in drought and heat. And there we're largely talking about those on thin soils lost quite a lot of abundance. But the ones to pick out, peacock, tortoiseshell, dark green fritillary, they really just couldn't cope with the conditions. And for the second year running, small tortoiseshell almost failed to have a second generation. Normally, it will have a first generation, and they'll lay eggs in the next 3 or 4 weeks. It'll lay eggs; those will hatch in June. Then there'll be another generation. Because of the heat in June and the very poor nettle quality, because nettle just stopped growing in the heat. Nettle is a soft, succulent, water-loving, damp-loving species, and they just stopped growing, went blue and horrible. And the result is that those insects emerge, but they're not sexually, they're not able to reproduce. They don't mature. They only have one thing they can do, and that is to hibernate. So the reason we saw so few later in the year is they hatched and they hibernated almost immediately. And the same with the peacocks. They hatched and hibernated very, very quickly. It's noticeable now in the south of England that the peacock is having a double brood. So they'll emerge in early July and actually attempt to second brood. In Yorkshire, we've not ever seen that, unless you tell me different, but I've never seen any double brooding. On the continent, it's normal, and I think that's an adaptation to climate change. More species are going double broods that if they can. Whether it's a genetic alteration, it could be that genetics is involved in moving to double broods. So that shows you the overall picture. But you notice things like northern brown argus, because it always lives on very dry sites, suffers. Small heath on sandy or upland sites, it suffered. Ringlet, very sensitive, only likes damp conditions, suffered a lot. Green vein white, a damp lover, suffered a lot. Others, a lot of species were in between. Some species did rather well after the hot, dry conditions. And on some sites, small skipper and small copper and common blue did exceptionally well. But not every site. It's quite a mixed bag. If we now, just as a contrast, turn those percentages into numbers, it actually shows a quite more dramatic picture that all the pluses are dominated by two species, meadow brown and the gatekeeper. Both of them had record years. And the negatives, again, three species, ringlet, peacock, tortoiseshell, that we've already talked about. So this is numbers rather than percents. So the more common the species, obviously the bigger effect they have on this. You might be interested in this, and this is the effect on sites. So there's a very large difference, as I mentioned, between sites, particularly from the drought of 2022. So that you probably remember that plants shriveled. There would be very few places that eggs probably got desiccated in those conditions, and it had an effect on things. The worst affected, Hornby Hill. Anybody who's familiar with that? It's a very, very steep because it is so incredibly steep. I'm not surprised it suffered the most. Pexton Bank, another steep chalk bank. Three House Woodmeadow it's a sandy site, unusually, but sandy sites were badly affected by the drought too. At the other end of the scale, we can look at wet grasslands with lots of hedges. They had a really great time. Priory Fields is a grassland and hedgerow site. Lanrick Gate is purely hedgerows. Roundhay Shadwell is agricultural fields and hedgerows. Grasswood is woods. Sun Lane is a mixture. Going down the list, Askham Bog is a woodland. Bishop Wood, my site, is mostly woodland. Kipling Coast, but it is a flat site, not so much on a hill, and so on. But you notice there's a lot more winners than there are losers. What would happen if I put all that data that we gathered since the 90s, all those 1,000 years of data, and I haven't collated it all, I hasten to add, but I have managed to collate a lot of it. And I showed you this last year. If we bunged it all onto a graph and plotted it against the summer temperature, what would it look like? So follow the blue line to begin with. So that's temperature, and the blue straight line is the trend in the temperature. And that shows you the effects of the warming climate. So mean summer temperatures have risen 0.7. And the four hottest Mays, June, and Julys have been since 2017. And that rate of warming seems to be increasing. Over that period, the abundance is increased by nearly a third. But just follow where the green line is. The green line is your abundance of insects, and just see how closely that green line mirrors temperature. It's quite amazing. But sometimes, and you have a look here at 2013 was a warm year, but 2014 is when we got the big increase in abundance. 2018 was the big year for sunshine, but it was 2019 when we got the big surge in abundance. And 2022 was the hot year, but 2023 was when we saw the increase in abundance. So it appears to be all those eggs and young that are laid the year before, you don't see that big plus until the following year. So that's, I think, the other big reason that we see the results this last year. It's the cumulative effect of a warm year. It's also those warm years we saw earlier, those warm years also result in species spreading. And last year I talked a lot about the spread of different species. Last year was 2022 was a dispersal year, and 2023 was an abundance year with a bit of drought. Also during this period, rainfall is increasing, because that's the other factor in climate change. And some of it's good for our butterflies, some of it's bad for our butterflies. Actually, the weather's getting more extreme, so the number of rainy days is actually not increasing by the same amount as moisture. Remember, I'm just looking here from the summer. So this is June, July, and August. In other words, when butterflies are at their most active. It's not a whole year. Sunshine hours, as you can see, the red line follows almost exactly the temperature. Yeah. So you can see here this year, there's 2014, our best year, measured year in recent times. We were just a whisker. I think it was 3 or 4 butterflies away from of reaching 2014. I promised you just a quick rundown of another 6 varieties. So hang on to your seats again, because I'm going to make this very quick. There's no tables, it's all graphs. Orange tip. There's some startling big numbers in these charts, plus and minus. But orange dip is certainly one that's doubled in abundance in the last 30 years. And you see the graph here. It dips and it rises, as you can see. In recent times, that rise, and this is the straight line is the if you plotted a line through that point, that's trend line. The orange line is that moving average, which actually is more useful than that line, because you can see what's happening in the recent term. But you can see that line is getting quite steep. So the rate of change is increasing, as you can see here. 64% in 20 years, 115 in the last 10. And also here, which we introduced last year, is the occupancy. Remember I mentioned about abundance and occupancy. This is actually the percentage of all the squares that were visited, monads that were visited in the year. This is the percentage that contained that species. It kind of gets rid of a lot of errors that you get with casual records, which are okay, but not terribly useful for doing stuff with, because it's not gathered in a scientific way. It's just somebody saw in a certain place. This is our best guess of what's happening in terms of it tends to follow the abundance, but is a different measure. It's actually the percentage of you can imagine is the percentage of land area occupied by that species. It's probably much bigger than that, but at least it's a consistent way of measuring. And you can see that as well as the abundance rising, that's also rising, not by the same amount. It's a bit slower, but it is rising. It's a big beneficiary of climate change. The warm, wet springs in particular, it loves. So you might remember 2018 was a warm spring, 2019 was a very warm spring, and you get a massive peak like here, because this is a spring butterfly. So maybe we should expect that. Gatekeeper. Well, yeah, the graph tells the story. This year was unbelievable in terms of numbers. I've never seen so many. There have been occasions in the past, back in the 90s, where there've been occasional really good years for them in South Yorkshire. But this time it was much more all over Yorkshire, so we get a much bigger impression here of what's going on. Remember, this is an average of the whole of Yorkshire. So it's up 120%, 400% in the last 10 years. That slope there is very high. And again, in terms of distribution, it's increasing. You see dips, and that's interesting because it follows on both lines. You see this dip, but then we did have, you probably remember 2007 was a really wet year, 8 was a very wet year, 9 was a diabolical summer. And it dipped, and it didn't really summers didn't really pick back up until 2016 did we see this rise. And you see this in almost all species, that in those last 8 years, there's been a big change. So if you look at the last 10 years and use that, three out of 4 of our species are in a state of rising. Only 1 in 4 is decreasing. What happened this year? I guess it's related to last year and the hot June. It must have just landed perfect for them. So a combination probably of things. Comma. Remember, this is a new arrival in Yorkshire. You can actually see it here because I put a 30-year graph in. You can actually see it arriving and begin to build up. It then had a dip during those wet years that I've just mentioned, and then it began from about 2016. It began to slowly rise, and then wallop. Well, this year, I haven't seen a year anything like it. It wasn't everywhere, but almost universally across the Vale of York, it had a wonderful time. Again, with occupancy, it's still spreading, it's still increasing. Some dramatic numbers there. Small Heath. Now, this is one of the losers. I think it's partly heat, partly nitrogen, partly drought. All things related to it's a triple whammy of negatives for the poor old Small Heath. It doesn't like drought, and you can see these last 2 years here. It dipped significantly. It dipped after the last warm spell, 2013, 2014. It dived to an even lower figure, and then after 2006, another really hot summer, it dived, and it took some time for it to build back up afterwards. And that's also shown on the occupancy. That's on the way down. The trend, it did dip more strongly as the climate warmed. It did in those couple of cool summers, 2020, 2021. It actually staged a comeback here. But unfortunately, that was cut short by 2022. So it seems to be really strongly influenced by heat, drought. But it does need, it hates nitrogen, but that's another story. Speckled woods, another late arrival on the scene, and probably one of the most universal butterflies that we see now all the way through the years. I mean, you can see it from anywhere from the next few weeks all the way through till late October, at any time in between, because it's multi-brooded. But if you go back, take the clock back to 2007, back here, it wasn't actually that very common. It was mostly woodland edge. But then we had those really wet, sometimes warm summers. And it came, I know in 2008, it came into our garden. That's the first time I've ever seen it in our garden. But it's returned almost every year since. We have a hedgerow at the bottom of our garden. And I think we think of it as a woodland insect. I don't think it is at all anymore. I think it's a hedgerow species, and it's adapted to a new set of conditions. And that's the other thing about climate change. Grass growth is much lusher than I can ever remember back to my childhood. The growth of grasses is lusher. It's perfect for the speckled wood, which loves the grasses that grow in partial shade, particularly if it's damp. And I think that's what we're seeing. It's a big beneficiary of climate change and the warmer, wetter summers. These last 2 years, and you see them here, something crazy has happened. You see them here. They've just gone completely crazy. And this brings me to another interesting point. There's been a huge decline of small tortoiseshell and peacock during these last 2 years. But of course, when they go down, their parasites go down. Now, speckled wood, some people believe, is the way that the tortoiseshell parasite, the new one, Sturmia bella, it overwinters in speckled wood and then comes back onto the tortoiseshell the following spring. The life cycles are pretty closely linked. So something very interesting going on there. I don't fully understand it. But if you look at comma, the same thing is happening. Comma has also gone crazy. even though it lives in the same conditions as peacock and tortoiseshell feeding on nettles, why has the comma done so well and the peacock tortoiseshell done so badly? Is it related to the parasites? Because the other thing was during 20 and 21, peacock and tortoiseshells were having a boom time and comma went down. So is it to do with the parasite? I don't know, but I think it's an interesting idea that all these species could be interacting. Common blue has got to be one of our worst stories in terms of numbers, how much it's declined in the last 20 years, 80% decline. That mirrors some of the figures that butterfly conservation pump out of 80% decline. But always remember, when you hear those figures from butterfly conservation, they always quote 1976 as their starting point, because that's when transects began. But 1975, 1976 were two of the best butterfly years on record. So obviously, if you compare against the best years on record, everything's going to be down. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean a lot. And I don't think so much of it is true, and definitely not in Yorkshire. When we're having new species arrive one every 4 years, and we're seeing a 25% increase in abundance, I'm pretty hopeful that quite a lot of that will continue, although I am concerned for our scarce species and even some of our common species like the common blue and the small heath. What's going to happen on our reserves? What can we do to help these insects? And I think for the common blue in particular, it's sensitive to nitrogen. When nitrogen's involved, you can't control where nitrogen comes out of the air, and that's what we're talking about. It's agricultural waste. And coming back to that first picture of all the farmers protesting in their tractors, the Dutch government's put strict rules on how much nitrogen they can lose from a farm. And nitrogen is having a big effect on butterflies in Europe, particularly the Low Countries, Germany, etc. And the reason is, we all know it, that grasses quickly overwhelm small flowering herbs like birdsfoot trefoil. I know Yorkshire Wildlife go to great lengths with their grazing regimes to try and minimize the effects, but you can't stop nitrogen coming out of the air. Bye for now. Thank you.